Welcome back, fourth graders. Hope you had a great weekend. Last week we finished up on Friday from our story, The Road to Revolution. We were looking at the beginnings of the American Revolution, putting some vocabulary words in and taking some notes. And we finished on Friday with this timeline. The timeline was taking the events and putting them in order from the story, The Road to Revolution. Now, if you remember, we added it into our notebook. In our reader's notebook, we had sequence of events from before. We had some information on there already, and we just added it right to the bottom. This thing called chronological order. Because remember, sequence is just the order of events, the order that things happen, how one thing follows another. And so a timeline is used to put events in chronological order. Chronological is according to when they happened. So from the oldest to the newest event. And we place them on a timeline. But our timeline was from our materials packets that we had before. We found this timeline in there. And we put the post-it notes from start according to the dates from the oldest to the newest, and then finish down here. And some of you did add some extras. Some of you tried to put some other things in there. But if you take a look at the 4 post-its that we had from last week, we had notes about 1763. That's when Britain ended that long war with France. And King George III, he started raising all these taxes and charging money to the settlers, to the colonists. And then we had that event, the main event from this story about the road to revolution, about that boy, Christopher, and how he was shot and killed. So this would be the first event, 1763. 1770 comes after that. So on our timeline, February 22nd, 1770 would be next. So that was the next event. That boy was shot. Then not much after that, 2 weeks, in fact, after his funeral on March 5th, 1770, that's when this thing happened called the Boston Massacre. British troops shot these 5 colonists dead in what was known as the Boston Massacre. And then in April 19, 1775, that's 5 years after these events that pretty much brought all the colonists to the point of wanting to be their own separate country and to be free from Britain. Finally, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at the battles of Concord and Lexington. That was on April 19th of 1775. So those events in order from the very oldest, when they ended their war with France, to the boy being shot, to the Boston Massacre when more people were killed after the funeral, to when the first shots of the actual battle of Concord and Lexington were fired. So our sequence of events or chronological order follows in that way. So those first shots were fired at Concord and Lexington. Shortly after that, then, we had what was called our Declaration of Independence. You see there, July 4th, 1776. We celebrate every year this holiday, the 4th of July. And the 4th of July is when we declared our independence. Now, a lot of people think that that was kind of the beginning of our country, the Declaration of Independence. But it wasn't. The Declaration of Independence was just us as a country, as a bunch of colonists saying, we want to be free from the King of England. We want to be our own country. But there was still a long, long ways to go before we were actually a free country. So we declared our independence, that's that Declaration of Independence, from Great Britain. We declared it to the world. We declared it to England. We declared it to everybody that we wanted to become our own free country. But there was a long time between that and when we actually did become our own free country. And I put that post-it note here down at the end, September 3rd, 1783. That's when the United States and Great Britain actually signed the Treaty of Paris. And that's when the United States became their own free country from Great Britain. So there was a lot of things that happened in between. We declared our independence, and then a bunch of things happened before we finally were free from Great Britain. One of those events is the one that I highlighted earlier, this winter of 1777. And that's the one that goes along with the climate of the Northeast, the things that Mr. Van Horn was talking about in our studies of the Northeast climate. And so I'm going to add in here one more post-it note that talks about that winter of 1777 and 1778. George Washington set up this camp in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. He set this camp up for the winter. And we have a reading that goes along with that. It also has this picture, I think, that says a lot too. A lot of times the picture is worth 1,000 words, if you've ever heard of that saying. And so we're going to talk about Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and the winter of 1777, and how that ties in with what we understand about the climate of the Northeast. However, we need to go and find out what in the world happened to Honey Rose. She's been kind of absent from our lessons. I have a feeling that she escaped and took a vacation. I bet you she took a vacation to someplace warm. Because as you know, the climate here in Minnesota, as we're in the winter for us, is also cold and can be snowy for sure. Well, let's go check out and see what she's up to. Well, there you are. I was wondering what happened to you. Did you go on a vacation last week, Rosie? The kids were wondering about you last week. You didn't have any lessons with them. Where in the world did you... It looks like you went someplace warm. You have your sunglasses on and your beach hat. How fun was that? Well, Honey Rose, the kids want to see you some more and have you do another lesson with them. Can you come down and do a lesson on the climate of the Northeast a little bit? Talk about some history of the Northeast? Can you do that with us? All right. Thanks, Honey Rose. Well, that explains it. Honey Rose was off on a vacation last week. What a lucky dog. She spent her time at the U.S. Virgin Islands. Beautiful, warm area. The weather and the climate there is just gorgeous. So now that explains what happened to her. I figured something must be going on because she was nowhere to be found. Well, as we go on and talk about the climate of the Northeast, we know that Mr. Van Horn had us do some notes in our notebook that went along with the climate of the Northeast. And we found out that the normal weather, because that's what climate is like the average normal weather. That normal weather was kind of like what we experience here in Minnesota. There's these warm, hot, humid summers in the Northeast, but there's also cold, snowy winters. Like this word here, this word blizzard and nor'easter. In fact, just this last weekend, they talked about the Northeast getting their first nor'easter, this heavy storm with high winds blowing from the Northeast. So we have all this vocabulary that goes along with the Northeast, and it actually goes together with this event that I'm going to share with you next, this winter of 1777, this Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and the really bad weather they had. In fact, the picture looks a lot like one of our words again, if you take a look at what this looks like. So your assignment for today, before we start in on this reading about Valley Forge, about this event in the winter of 1777, is to go back and add on to your timeline, or if you hadn't had a chance yet to start on that, remember that was in your sequential order packet. Maybe you even want to just start on to a new one now that you have these other events that we put in today, talking about the history of the Revolutionary War. In the packet, there's plenty of extra timelines. If you were to page here towards the back, you'll find there's plenty of blank ones. You could pull another one out and start to use that. But let's finish up in this timeline. Let's get some of this information in here before we start to look at the event that goes along with the climate, talking about the winter of 1777. All right, Good luck, and we will see you again tomorrow.